World Solution Writing Process, Podcast, Episode 11, Change of Government. So, we're creating the social conditions for a revolution. Protests, strikes, civil disobedience, maybe riots. They're all escalating, they're all growing, they're all increasing, creating various opposition movements electorally, labor unions, periodicals, communities, podcasts, anti-capitalist Dungeons and Dragons campaigns, whatever. Literally whatever. There's a bigger issue, though. A much bigger issue. How do we go from creating these mass conditions of unrest, the political conditions for revolution, to actually carrying out a change of government itself? Besides protest, civil disobedience, mass strikes, riots, organizations, it also helps to have a parallel government. One of the problems with January 6th is Trump really had no parallel government. He had his fake electors, which were sort of like a parallel government, but you have to be more explicit. I mean, what if Trump said, I just think the country is in a state of decline and I want to constitute a new legislature or like a new administration, a new regime on the basis of saving America from its degeneracy? It's interesting. Maybe that would have been less successful than January 6th, but possibly it could have been much more successful because he would have been honest about what he was doing, and it would have been formed on a much more firm political basis than claiming an election was stolen that really wasn't. The problem is, for a change of government in the United States, the closest thing we have is January 6th. It's kind of the closest thing to the October Revolution, but this carries many problems because obviously the politics of January 6th were pure reactionary. The act itself, in the case of January 6th, was unjustified. It had no parallel government as well, whereas the Russian Revolution did. That's one of the, besides the, having totally opposite politics, to compare the October Revolution and January 6th. There's also the fact that January 6th was less successful because the Bolsheviks had the parallel government of the workers' councils and the Soviets. It's also a problem because when you discuss January 6th, you're discussing something highly illegal, something that should be highly illegal. However, when discussing illegal actions, it's legal to discuss these things but not to do them. So for now, we should just be developing theory and strategy. It's also possible that this section may be unnecessary and hopefully will be. As an aside, I should say, to advocate something like a socialist January 6th sounds insane. But if you think about the October Revolution, it was kind of close to that. So it would be better to say what we're trying to do may take the form of January 6th in some ways, but in other ways would actually be carried out by the type of people who would have participated in the George Floyd movement. Just to be clear, because I know politics can get confusing, and when you try to say, oh, we use the form of the enemy, but the content of ourselves, things can get murky, and I just want to be very clear where I stand on things. That I'm not in any way saying January 6th was a good thing. It was wrong. And in some ways, George Floyd constituted a comparable insurgency, but it never moved against the seat of government, at least in any significant way. So that's the difference. Try to understand. Thanks for your understanding. In Gene Sharp, he talks about something called bouncing on the heads of society. At least that's mentioned in his movie, How to Start a Revolution. I haven't really found where it is in the text. I'm going to look that up in the text. But anyway, the point is, say you have a dictatorship and the masses are in revolt against this dictator. And not only are the people in the streets against the dictator, but even the dictator's own branches of government or bureaucratic departments and ministries and administrations are beginning to waver in their loyalty to this dictator. Imagine being the dictator as you're being overthrown. You call the Ministry of the Interior. Your call is not answered. You call the military, say, crack down on these protesters. And the military says, we're having a tough time doing that. It's not going so well. So the military is not openly disobeying you, but they're giving you pushback. Say you call the police. The police say, we stand with the people. We're not enforcing. You call the intelligence services, the secret police. You don't get an answer. This is bouncing on the heads of society, where you are trying to invoke your authority in different places, but the mechanisms that used to obey you no longer do. And at this point, you could say the dictator's already been overthrown. However, this is a dangerous and unstable situation of dual power, where at any moment, the old regime could begin reinstating itself, causing an avalanche, because if they can get one department to go back to obeying them, then that can start a domino effect, and then they can remain in power and wipe out all the protesters with lethal force and all the horrible things that we don't want to happen. So compare this to capitalism. Imagine we're overthrowing Joe Biden, but not in a January 6th way. It's anti-capitalists in the streets, demanding a new government based on radical democratic socialism. And he's calling all his people and they're not answering, and they're giving him pushback when he gets an answer on the phone. Would you have to arrest Joe Biden at that point? Maybe not. But you would have to go after United States Congress. And the issue is that in especially quote unquote representative nations, the issue is that legislatures are the main source of political legitimacy in supposedly democratic representative governments. The executive less so. And the executive may have more immediate power, but to generate repression. But in general social conditions where the obedience of the state to the capitalist government, which includes the three branches of legislative, executive, and judicial, is breaking down, then the legislature is really the main branch, in my opinion. The executive is secondary, and the judiciary is tertiary. So let's just say we have a situation where we're trying to overthrow United States Congress, and we have a radical democratic socialist parallel government rallying and holding its resolutions and raucous sessions where it's denouncing the legitimacy of United States Congress and calling for its disbandment and declaring itself the rightful government of the nation on the basis of the necessities of the people and the people's needs and the well-being of the people materially, stuff that should happen. And Congress orders the arrest of this parallel government, but the police don't obey the orders, and you're just sort of stuck in limbo for a minute. That's dual power. And this is kind of what happened between the Soviets in 1917, or I should say the workers' councils, and the Russian provisional government, which was capitalist. There was this sort of moment where both governments ordered each other's arrest. There was also a moment in the German Revolution where, as the monarchy, the Kaiser, abdicated, two different republics were declared on the same day. A democratic, a capitalist republic and a socialist republic. So, what if you're in this dual power situation and the legitimacy of the legislature is teetering, the old capitalist legislature? But it's not gone completely. It hasn't disbanded. It hasn't stopped meeting. What do you do? The classic question of the dungeon master to the Dungeons and Dragons adventurers. What do you do? It's a pretty tricky case of what do you do. It's not like, oh, the ogre swings his club at you. What do you do? It's two opposing governments representing two opposing economic systems are teetering on the edge of power in the same country. What do you do? We know what the Bolsheviks did. The Bolsheviks disbanded the old government. And essentially, that's what I'm saying we should do, except in the Bolshevik situation, it was a firefight, to quote Boondock Saints. But I'm hoping we can get away with something less combative. January 6th went pretty far, but no shots were fired, at least by the reactionary protesters. Maybe we can pull off something like that. January 6th is not the only example. In the Ukraine 2014 situation, there was a small firefight between protesters and police. But when it came to occupying the actual government buildings, it was pretty much just protesters marching in. And there seems to be an increasing trend around the world of protesters storming various government buildings. Another more friendly example is the Serbia bulldozer revolution of the year 2000, where Milosevic was overthrown. Protesters just sort of stormed one of the main government buildings. The police had decided to back off and stand aside earlier. So if we can just persuade and or demoralize the police into just backing off and refusing to enforce control over main buildings, then we can win without shots being fired. But it's probable that if you do this, the old government will just flee and disperse and try to meet elsewhere. And that's the problem because they're still acting as a center of authority. So at some point, their meetings are going to have to be broken up. They're going to have to be rounded up. You're going to have to arrest them if they keep meeting. And they will probably keep meeting for a while. Probably going to take multiple waves of this cat and mouse game, as I said in the Managing the Old Regime episode. So let's just talk about how to arrest rulers. Rule number 1 of how to arrest a very powerful person is just do it. Sometimes you just have to zip tie a punk. Now, in whose authority are you doing this? You're doing it in the name of the parallel government, in whose name this disbandment action is occurring. Zip ties and sticks were one of the only redeeming parts of January 6th, which was definitely a pro-Trump deep state operation, and as such is a disgrace to everyone in uniform for being so poorly executed. Just because the politics of January 6th were all wrong doesn't mean they were wrong about zip ties. Zip ties are these little plastic things that you put them in a loop and then they get snug and you can't pull them apart. So sometimes at protests, police, they don't have enough handcuffs because handcuffs actually cost a little bit of money. So they use this cheaper substitute known as zip ties, where they just take this piece of plastic and zip it around your wrists and then they're stuck together. Handcuffs are also pretty cheap, and duct tape or rope will do to fasten wrists together in emergencies. To apprehend the old regime, the first thing you need is for the pillars of state, including security forces, to either stand aside or even help. The second thing you need is people to carry out the apprehension or arrest, either political volunteers such as protesters, or members of organizations, as well as professional security forces, or a combination of the two. The third thing you need is the psychological willingness to lay your hands on a senator, while the professional troops waver and hesitate. Don't hold back. Verbal mockery establishes the proper tone for wrestling public officials to the ground by their shoulders and securing hands behind backs. Sometimes you have to set the tone for yourself and be your own revolutionary drill sergeant, your own commissar. This is where theory becomes critical, as it provides the justification for action. And no action creates more wavering than change of government. An official being arrested by the revolutionaries may be bold enough to threaten the apprehenders, perhaps threatening your job or imprisonment. They may play dirty, insinuating that they could use their intelligence or other connections to murder or torture the families of those activists and or officers participating in the apprehension. If the apprehending forces are a mix of popular and military forces, or rather I should say professional security forces, at this point you may have to remind any nervous professional soldiers that we're doing this for everyone's children, and so the politicians and bosses and people like Epstein can't do anything to anyone's children, including yours. This is why hardcore political revolutionaries, i.e. activists of revolutionary organizations, must be present during the apprehension. Professional forces are too easily confused or frightened by the political manipulation of the people they're sent to arrest. I mean, imagine we're having a revolution, there's a parallel government, the parallel government is disbanding the old ruling government, and the security forces have decided to stand aside, and some of them have even decided to participate. Some of them might be real nervous about arresting their old bosses, naturally. So thus in regime change, the personal touch is required. If you're reading this, you should probably be one of the political revolutionaries leading the breaches and apprehensions. In other episodes, I'll get into how to breach and clear, room-to-room fighting. Of all the combat that makes any kind of sense in the model of revolution I'm advocating, preferably none is the first thing. But if there's any, it's not going to be guerrilla warfare. It's not going to be conventional warfare of tanks versus tanks or airplanes or any of that. It's going to be surgical. It's going to be breach and apprehension, room-to-room fighting, close combat. So anyway, while the above section sounds violent, it doesn't have to be. January 6th proves that no politician is brave enough to make a last stand with a firearm to defend the government. Like, imagine if instead of evacuating during January 6th, the congresspersons just stayed there and had firearms and said, "We're not leaving this chamber." Rah, rah, rah. Like, that would have been a major obstruction to the protesters. Of course, the reactionary politicians are the ones most likely to even possess firearms, so it makes it an unrealistic scenario. But you can probably overthrow a government due to their unwillingness to defend themselves by just pushing and shoving some old rich people, the members of the legislature, securing their wrists and carting them around to various locations until they give up on reconvening, no guns required, or at least no shots fired. The fourth thing you need is either a temporary holding facility for all these scumbag politicians, or a list of residences to send them to house arrest until the threat of their reemergence is over. If you face them with the option of house arrest, instead of being locked in a conference room indefinitely, they'll probably give you their street addresses so you can take them home. You may need professional forces or volunteers to guard all these sites to prevent escapes, though volunteers may do, as long as they're not so bloodthirsty they execute the people they're guarding, the people they're imprisoning. You will need a spreadsheet to keep track of all these addresses. This is not anarcho-punk anymore. At this point, this is real-life law enforcement, but it's revolutionary law. It's not just the seat of government. Any key institution can have its director apprehended and replaced by professional forces or political volunteers by entering the building, physically removing the prior director and informing them of their termination, and announcing the installation of a new one. The pillars can themselves be subject to coups and revolutions just as easily as they can carry them out. The main issue is the legislature. The executive branch can be a problem, but without the support of a legislature and facing public opposition from both the parallel government and protest, either the executive can possibly be ignored, or the security situation will resolve itself in favor of the executive being deposed by their own security forces. This is an unstable and dangerous situation, but it's more dangerous to leave the old legislature in place than the old executive, due to legislatures being the main source of political legitimacy in governments, especially ones which claim to be democratic representative governments. To discourage physical resistance to arrest, it may help to verbally communicate, saying things like, "This is revolution, do what we tell you." You have to become the kind of person comfortable with taking authority and enforcing it with your hands, essentially by grabbing, subduing, and restraining people who don't want to be arrested. Some of those figureheads may need a little wrestling. This is way outside of a lot of people's comfort zones, but the damage capitalist governments have inflicted on humanity should get you over your squeamishness. Definitely watch RoboCop and Judge Dredd to psychologically prepare. You can say, I am a volunteer of the rightful government and you are being placed under a citizen's arrest. If you feel the need to even say anything, you really don't have to. If they argue with you verbally, it's best to tune them out and just drag them to wherever they need to be taken. The trick to handcuffs is first you do one wrist, then you do the other. That may sound obvious, but CIA manuals prepare people for emotional tasks by scripting them with simple instructions, and this is no different. Also, it helps to watch YouTube videos to get the little tricks of it. Okay, for example, you don't keep the handcuffs open. You keep them in a closed position, but you press one side against the person's wrist. The cuff naturally rotates and snaps and clicks around from the other direction. You should watch YouTube to see what I'm talking about. If you're nervous, you can get a cheap set of handcuffs and practice cuffing and unlocking yourself for a practice buddy. Police training prepares officers to have a commanding presence. For police, this is natural because the ruling state assigns them authority. For revolutionaries, we must psychologically assign ourselves authority as officers of the revolutionary government. Self-appointment is the heart of power. So you can cuff and search someone while keeping them in a standing, kneeling, or lying down position. For a regime change, police training might make more sense than military-oriented small unit tactics, though both are beneficial. So what I'm saying is there are people who have police training, there are people who have infantry training, military small unit tactics training, who may no longer be part of any, maybe they're retired, or maybe they work in like some other profession like bounty hunters, maybe have some kind of police style training. So having people in your regime change team who have these skills is good. And don't overthink it because all of this is on YouTube. You can look up how to arrest someone on YouTube. There are a lot of police training each other on YouTube. There's a lot of military training each other on YouTube. Small unit tactics is basically like move and fire tactics. If you're pinned down and you're being fired upon by enemy forces, how do you get out of that? You take cover and then you have part of your team carry out a move while the other part of your team provides covering fire. And then you switch roles and keep leapfrogging, fire and movement. Like that's the essence of small unit tactics. There are other things like flanking. There are other things like sector assignment. Each person in the group is assigned to look in a certain place and keep watch and then communicate with each other about what's going on in their visual sector. And then there's other things like, breach and entry tactics where you stack up on a door. And then each person alternates left and right in terms of what part of the room they're supposed to cover immediately upon entry. And that, if we really need to get anything perfectly down, it's really stacking up, breach and clear, but I'll get into that in future episodes. However, it is possible to push past security forces without trying to hurt them. The great example of this is the Dharasana assault raid, in which Gandhi acted as a coordinating commander of a non-violent takeover of a building against obstructing government forces. They used ladders, they used huge swarms of people, outnumbering the security forces. If anyone sees you drilling small unit tactics, tell them it's choreography for a play or a movie, a marching band, or a dance routine. Sometimes you just have to tell people to surrender and to do what you say. Do what I tell you is a phrase that might feel uncomfortable, but it's sometimes necessary, and this might be one of those times. Another example is do as I say. I get that one from Halloween, the horror movie, slasher movie. The Scream Queen, in the middle of it, the kids are just like, what's going on? And there's a murder on the loose, and she's like, do what I say! I'm like, yeah, that's what I need during the change of government. That's the spirit. Anyway, whether a citizen's arrest can be done non-violently is a fair question. It is possible to firmly use force in the sense of restraining a person without resorting to brutality in the sense of beating them. You can wrestle someone into submission without harming them. You may have to tell onlookers who could potentially interfere to step away. For example, if you're arresting one politician and other politicians start getting close and verbally protesting. When I was at the Eagles victory celebrations, there was a security guard guarding the city hall, and I got up to him, kind of near his face, and he screamed at me, "Get the fuck back!" at the top of his lungs. That might be a phrase that you have to use during a change of government. Another one was during anti-fascist Black Bloc against a Nazi rally on the steps of the Trenton State House in early 2011. The Black Bloc was approaching the Nazi rally from some other angle, like the back or the side. But then police got in the way, and there was a video of one cop that I can't find saying, "Keep going, you can get locked up." And he just kept saying it over and over. "Keep going, you get locked up." And like, people think they're brave, but those Black Bloc people, those Black Bloc kids, they stopped the moment the cop said that. They went no further. So there are ways to control people with words, especially if there is a threat of not so much violence, but forceful restraint behind those words. In future episodes, I'll get more into like, what is a coup d'etat? How does a coup d'etat work? I'll get more into the potential of room-to-room fighting and breaching and clearing. But this is all stuff we'd prefer to avoid. I'm also going to go into episodes about, pure nonviolence, laughtivism, throw events that are funny to create the social conditions where the old system just disintegrates and collapses and none of this forceful stuff is necessary, preferably. I'm just giving everyone the full toolkit of both forceful and non-forceful methods, saying that the non-forceful methods are always preferable and usually more successful, but you can have the forceful methods in your back pocket in case they become somehow unavoidable through some unpredictable turn of events. Just a reminder, it is legal to discuss these things. It is illegal to do them. So we're talking at the level of theory. We are now, like I am now. You can just sort of say whatever. But if you were actually to concretely plan something like this, you would definitely need to be using offline channels, secure channels, in-person communication. You'd need to be using all manner of security measures. You'd need to be discussing these things with phones out of the room, with electronic devices out of the room, or with phones in signal blocking bags. Need to be discussing them in places that are unlikely to be surveilled by any kind of microphones, hidden microphones, away from security cameras. So preferably none of this is necessary. Preferably we can just hold a bunch of artistic happenings and the crowds will love us and we'll form a parallel government and the security forces will flip to our side and the old government will just be rendered irrelevant. But it's not always that simple. As we saw during the Russian Revolution in October, the security forces were split. That's a bummer. And they had to do a thing. It was a small battle. But the more you create social conditions through protest methods and parallel government, which are favorable to a change of government, the less violence there will be. The stronger organized is the working class and the people in the change of government, the less divided the security forces will be, and the more they would simply be on the side of the revolution. So we can minimize violence by doing it right. Not by doing the violence right, but by doing revolution right. And even if you have to be forceful, you can be forceful minimally. Forceful but not harmful. And some people would say technically that's not violence if you're forceful but not harmful. So kind of a heavy topic, but hopefully you can see the humor in my fantasies of a bunch of sweaty old ultra-rich politicians sweating like pigs as the righteous wrath of the masses finally descends upon them and they feebly protest their apprehension and arrest as the cuffs go around them and they're dragged out to temporary holding facilities and house arrest. I mean, you can understand how that's an attractive fantasy, even if you think it's politically irresponsible. So anyway, this has been World Solution Writing Process Podcast, Episode 11, signing off.